All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Rabbi Mark Katz. I'm the rabbi at Temple Ner Tamid, and we are so privileged to be able to welcome Aaron Lansky tonight. So I want to tell you a little bit about Aaron, though a lot of the talk is actually learning a little bit more about Aaron. So Aaron Lansky is the founder and the president of the Yiddish Book Center, a nonprofit organization working to recover, celebrate, and regenerate Yiddish and modern Jewish literature and culture. Since 1980, Aaron and his colleagues have rescued more than 1 million Yiddish books, most of which would otherwise have been lost or destroyed. Today, they're bringing old books to the new readers through groundbreaking initiatives in digitization, translation, oral history, and education. Aaron holds a BA in Jewish history from Hampshire College, a master's in Eastern European Jewish Studies from McGill University, and an honorary doctorate from Amherst College, Hebrew Union College, and the State University of New York. He's received numerous awards and recognitions, including the so-called Genius Grant from MacArthur Foundation. His best-selling book, Outwitting History: The Amazing Adventures of a Man Who Rescued 1 Million Yiddish Books, won the Massachusetts Book Award in Nonfiction in 2005, and in 2014, the Yiddish Book Center received the National Medal for Museum and Library Services in the White House ceremony. And if you're interested in purchasing that book, if you're inspired by him, I know that we likely have people from not our general area, because I know the Yiddish Book Center sent this out. This was also on a few different kind of national lists in terms of great programs for the night. But if you live local, I'm going to put in the link. Otherwise, you can, of course, look it up through other means, Barnes & Noble or Amazon. But we like to support our local bookstore here in Montclair, Bloomfield, Glenridge area. So the link is right here for you, Watchung Booksellers. And so they've ordered a few extra copies, and hopefully you'll get a chance. Actually, I realize you don't have the full link. I left off a letter, so I'm going to put it in one more time. They will have it available to you. So hopefully, if you're going to buy it and you live local, you use our local bookstore to buy it. So with that, it's my pleasure to welcome Aaron tonight, and just to tell you a second about why we chose to invite him here to speak to us. So there's no question that Yiddish has had this rebirth. And I'm curious, if you want to raise your hand, who here has been, if you live local, to, let's say, I don't know, the Yiddish Fiddler on the Roof, right? I'm seeing a bunch of hands because it was huge in this area, right? Keep your hands up. Add your hand if you've read some Yiddish literature in translation or in Yiddish lately, or if you're a reader of the Forward, right, which is a newspaper that was originally in Yiddish, and who the editor-in-chief and the publisher are both members of our congregation.
Really?
Yeah. There's Yiddish camps, there's Yiddish music. Yiddish is huge. And so there's a reason, a sociological reason why it is so popular. And the Yiddish Book Center is on the cutting edge of that. And so it's our pleasure to be able to talk to Aaron tonight and to hear from him exactly why Yiddish has had this renaissance. And so without further ado, I'm going to spotlight his video for everybody. Though if you want to see everybody, you can always go back to gallery view and see everyone. So without further ado, Aaron Lansky.
Rabbi, thank you very much. I don't know if anybody saw the New York Times this morning and saw the conversation between Gail Collins and Brett Stevens. Anybody happen to notice that this morning? I can see your hands. I can't hear you, but I can see hands. Brett Stevens, you may know, he's the conservative columnist at the Times, one of them. And he's not only Jewish, he comes from Mexico, and he's brilliantly erudite and actually very deeply Jewish and quite learned. He was stationed in Israel for a long time. In his column today, in his conversation with Gail Collins, who's definitely not Jewish, Brett Stevens used not one, not two, but 3 different Yiddish words and expressions. I thought that was kind of an all-time record for the New York Times, and it happened on the day that I was speaking here this evening, so it was the perfect setup for me. You want to know the words he used? He used chutzpah, and not only did he use chutzpah, but he was sufficiently nuanced to give both its American Jewish meaning and its Israeli meaning, although what he identified as the Israeli meaning was actually the original Yiddish meaning. I'll let you look at the paper for the rest of that. He, of course, used oy vey, and you'll see the context for that as well. The third wasn't a Yiddish word exactly, but it was close enough. it was something that could apply to Purim, but I think he was applying it to much more recent events, and he said, he came, he tried to destroy us, we won, let's eat, which is, of course, the key to every Jewish holiday, especially Purim, that's coming up very, very soon. So I think it's no accident that Brett Stevens used 3 Yiddish words or expressions in the paper this morning, and no accident that the Times, which would have been loath to do this in the past, published that. I think that times of contradiction and uncertainty, such as the moment in which we are living, somehow demand Yiddish words. Jews have been on the outside for a very, very long time. Yiddish was a spoken language of roughly 3/4 of all the world's Jews for the past 1,000 years. Anyone know how many? I hate speaking on Zoom because I can't get the back and forth, but you can hold up fingers. Anybody know how many different Jewish languages there are? You know about Yiddish, right? And you certainly know Hebrew. What language was the second part of the Talmud written in? The Gemara written in is what? Aramaic, right? Just like the Kaddish and others, part of a little bit of the Haggadah as well, and also Ladino. But there were also a whole bunch of others: Judeo-Persian, Judeo-Provençal, Judeo-Tat. I mean, there are many, many, many different, 18 different Jewish languages. Of all of those, Yiddish was spoken by more Jews in more places for a longer period of time than any other, including Hebrew. Now, that's truly saying something, and it might explain why, since the pandemic began, from where we sit, as the rabbi suggested, we are seeing an interest, a surge of just curiosity, passion, determination to learn more about Yiddish than we've ever seen before, and what we've seen in the past year since the pandemic began. So I'm eager to tell you, what's happening and why that may be happening. But first, I figure a little bit of background's in order. Rabbi, you have to remind me, how much time have I got before we open up for questions, more or less?
Well, I think we're going to do about 45 minutes, and then we'll do about 15 minutes of questions.
Okay. If I go on too long, you don't have to be shy about cutting in, okay? I won't be offended, I promise. It's just there's so much to tell you about. It's a whole world here, and I've been doing this for 41 years, so there were a lot of stories that built up over that time. Do you know the story about, there's an expression in Yiddish, they say al regel achas, which means on one foot. And of course it refers to the conflict many, many years ago, thousands of years ago, between Hillel and Shammai. And one of Shammai's students went to Hillel and said, if you're so great, I want you to explain to me the whole Torah while you're standing on one foot. And anyone know what Hillel said, what the answer was? It was a really good answer. Norman, if I can you unmute him, Rabbi?
Mute.
Well done.
I don't know the exact words, but it was to treat others as you would want to be treated.
Actually, it was the opposite of that. It was not to treat others. Yeah, Jesus said what you just said. But Hillel had a more Jewish thing, which says, don't do unto others what you don't want them to do to you, which seems to me would prevent a whole lot of mischief. Because if you look at all of our history, a lot of the trouble we've gotten into is when people thought they knew what was good for us. So therefore, it is a subtle distinction there. But it gave rise.
Forgive me, Aaron. You have to forgive me. I'm doing a story this week, "Conversion of the Jews" by Philip Roth, and that's where I got twisted because he deliberately twisted in that. Story.
Exactly. Well done. Good. Well, so this gave rise to much of Yiddish is very deeply rooted in Jewish tradition and Jewish learning, and so it gave rise to this very everyday expression, al regel achas, while standing on one foot. It means to do it in a nutshell, and that's what I'm going to try to do today. So I'll tell you very, very briefly that in 1980, I was a graduate student in Yiddish literature studying with Ruth Weiss at McGill University in Montreal. And I decided to take what I thought at the time was going to be a 2-year leave of absence from graduate school to go save the world's Yiddish books before it was too late. We bluffed our way into a lease on... I forgot to tell you. I didn't stay in Montreal to do this, only because the Parti Québécois, the French nationalists, had just taken power, and there was a little anti-Semitism in the wind, and it was just too tense up there. So Ruth suggested, I was thinking I'm going to go to New York, and Ruth, who knew far more than I, said, I think you need to go to a Jewishly neutral location. And Amherst, Massachusetts, where I'd gone to school, seemed perfectly Jewishly neutral at the time. So I went down there. It's much more Jewish nowadays. Bluffed our way into a lease on an old factory loft, banged out press release on an old government surplus electric typewriter, and set off to save the world's Yiddish books before it was too late. At the time, I met with scholars who estimated that there were about 70,000 Yiddish books still extant and recoverable. To this day, I'm not exactly sure how they came up with that number. All I can tell you is it was so breathtakingly wrong, because we saved 70,000 books in the first 6 months, and here we are 41 years later. We've saved 1.5 million volumes, and I'm technically still on leave from graduate school. So you can see how far all this has gone. I wrote a book, as the rabbi mentioned, in 2004 called Outwitting History, which recounted many of the adventures of those early years when I, as a young man, was on the road collecting books. It was all very dramatic and very exciting. When people started writing reviews of that book, they said, one called me the Jewish Indiana Jones, at which point my mother had to call me to tell me that, in fact, the real Indiana Jones was like a quarter Jewish. He kept track of these kinds of things. Anyways, I was perfectly flattered by that. You may have heard some of these stories over the years. There was a big story in the Times once when in 1980, shortly after we began, in the middle of the winter, we got a phone call from a friend in New York who said he had been walking down 16th Street, West 16th, and he came upon a garbage dumpster, and he said, it's full of Yiddish books. They're piled so high, they're kind of overflowing the sides of it, which is why I know about it. He said, and it looks like it's going to rain, and you got to get down here right away. That was long before we had a truck of our own, long before I had a car, but I did have an old pickup truck parked in the back of my house that hadn't run in 2 years. And somehow I turned the key in desperation, and it came to life like the phoenix. And my friends pushed it out of the snow, and I was able to get. I didn't even have a license plate. I put snow where the license plate should have been. Got down to the local train station. We still have one train a day from this area to New York City, but it went back then at 2 o'clock in the morning. So I hopped the 2 a.m. train, fell asleep. The conductor wakes me up in New York. I go running out on the street. It's like sleet and freezing rain. And when you run out of Penn Station and you're on 8th Avenue and you look across the street, what's that building across the street? The post office. And what's it say, that Herodotus quote on the top that I'll never get quite right, but something to the effect, neither snow nor rain nor gloom of night shall stay these couriers. So that was pretty inspiring for me. I raced down to 16th Street. I got there, must have been, 7:15, 7 o'clock in the morning. And there was a dumpster, all right, but it wasn't what I was expecting. Like, it wasn't the kind behind the Chinese restaurant. It was this big thing like you see at construction sites, those big green tractor trailer sized dumpsters. And the books had fallen out of it. And there were Yiddish books all over the street, and they're like lying splayed on the pavement, and cars are running over them, and everything's wet and miserable. And I figured I had to act very quickly. So, of course, this is before cell phones, so I had to quickly call up a bunch of friends on the payphone on the corner, woke everybody up. They all came down. We pooled our money, whatever we had between us. We went out, quickly rented the biggest U-Haul truck we could get, backed it up to the dumpster, and spent the rest of the day in the freezing rain saving the books. Ended up saving about 6,000 volumes that day. Maybe 2,000 books were kind of left behind, floating in this disgusting fetid pool at the bottom of the dumpster. The books we did save, we brought home, we dried them out. Many of them ended up at the Judaic collection at Oxford University. So there's a wonderful, it's kind of like Techiyas HaMesim. It brings them back to life in some way, is what was happening that day. And it was very gratifying. There were a gazillion stories like that, though. Another time I was called down to a place called the Coops, which was an old left-wing Jewish housing project in the Bronx. And I think it was Allerton Avenue and Bronx Park East. Got there, the Coops as a cooperative had gone bankrupt. A private landlord had taken over. He was trying to rent out some of the spaces. There was a very large Yiddish library in one of the communal spaces there, and he, the landlord, had scheduled a demolition crew to come in and tear the place apart and send everything off to the dump. And we got there. He gave us till noon to get the books out before the dump truck would arrive to take everything else away. We worked like crazy, but there must have been, 8,000 books or something there or more. And we could barely make a dent in it. And finally I realized that what had once been a Jewish housing project was now primarily black and Puerto Rican, and there were a lot of young kids in the neighborhood, and they were all kind of watching us. And finally, the boldest of them, maybe an 11-year-old boy named Victor, comes up to me and he said, "What are you guys doing here?" And I explained what this was and why these books were here and who had lived here before them. And he said, "Leave it to me, I'll get you some help." And he comes back 10 minutes later with maybe 15 young kids from the neighborhood, and they organize themselves into a bucket brigade from inside the building, up the stairs, out to the truck, hauled all the books out. Every kid in the neighborhood schlepped books that day, except for Victor himself. In light of his linguistic and organizational talents, he was the supervisor for all the rest of them. But we saved the collection. We got everything out in time. So stories like that were wonderful, and they usually made the newspapers, and they were very high profile. But I have to tell you that it only was it wasn't but it was no means the preponderance of the kind of book collecting we really did. Those are the exciting parts. The more everyday parts, though, that we would head out and go one house after the other and ring the doorbell. People would have called us in advance saying they had books for us. We'd walk in. They'd have a huge meal laid out for us. They always were ready for us with this. And first they would sit us at the kitchen table before they gave us a single book. These were always, Yiddish-speaking Jews with heavy accents in English. And then once they realized we spoke Yiddish, they would switch to Yiddish. They would serve us hot tea in glasses. That's a very old world kind of thing. They would ask us a million very presumptuous personal questions. They would test our Yiddish to make sure that we were worthy of accepting, receiving these books. They would say, "Junger Mann." Junger Mann means young man, and became kind of my generic name in the Yiddish world in those days. Till about 5 years ago, it was still my name in the Yiddish world. They would say, "Junger Mann." They would say, "Ot is mein Yerusha." This is my inheritance. And they would hand you these books, one book at a time, in this ritual. Then, of course, they would try to arrange shidduchim with their granddaughters. And obviously, they would overfeed us to such They would feed us to such a ridiculous degree. We used to carry a Boy Scout backpack in the truck. And in it, we had Tums and Alka-Seltzer and Japanese umeboshi plums and everything to kind of keep things down, because we had to eat so much more than was entirely healthy for us. After a few trips like that, we would usually visit 10 to 12 people in a single day. So this was really moving fast. We'd work anywhere from 12 to 16 hours a day doing this. And we quickly learned that we had to travel. I went alone the first time. Quickly learned to travel in groups of 3. 2 would do the schlepping, and the third person was the designated eater, who would sit with the people and try to eat the food and handle the conversation while the other 2 hauled the books out to the truck. I have a lot of stories I could tell you, but I'm going to skip over a really good one right now, only because we don't have enough time for it. But if we have time at the end, I'll throw it in. Remind me, and I'll tell you a very good story. What I will tell you, though, is that by the time my book came out, I started in 1980. By the time the book came out in 2004, 2005, almost nobody that I wrote about in the book was still alive. So it gives you a sense of how transitional that moment really was. If I had gone to do this 15 years earlier or even 10 years earlier, I don't think anybody would have understood the urgency of it. Yiddish, who cares about that, and why bother to save these books? And nobody would have understood the danger they were in. And if I had tried to do it 5 years later even, it would have been too late for most of the books. So it was just one of those great, what do they say, bachet, it was just truly a great stroke of fortune that I came exactly the right time to be able to do this. After my book came out, I realized there was only one woman that I knew who was that I had written about extensively, who was still alive, a woman named Sorel Skolnick. She was a Yiddish-speaking anarchist from Russia, who came to the United States. She worked as a dressmaker. She and her husband lived in a Yiddish-speaking anarchist commune outside of Peekskill somewhere in Crontown, New York. And she became one of our most active Zommlers. She used to go out in this old Dodge Dart and collect books for us. And when they piled up high enough, she'd call us and we'd go to her house and she'd serve us a great organic meal out of her own garden. And we would talk, and then she would find more books for us, and this went on for a very, very long time. Eventually, she had a stroke. She ended up living near her daughter in Long Island, and we used to go with our kids quite regularly to visit her. I remember that for our kids, it was a thrill to meet somebody from the old country like that, and somebody with her authenticity. She was quite brilliant. She always took the kids seriously. She had no sentimentality, not a trace of nostalgia about her. But she spoke to our kids who were very little at the time, very seriously, asked them what they were reading, and they loved her. Well, 3 months after my book came out, Sorrel died. And my wife and I went to the funeral, and it was in the middle of the winter, and we stood on this snowy hilltop cemetery in Westchester somewhere looking out over the Hudson River. And the day she died, Sorrel was 1 month shy of her 100th birthday. And I remember my wife leaned over to me and she said, "Do you realize that Sorrel was the last person our kids knew who still spoke with a Yiddish accent?" So it just shows you how much has changed, in this 40 years while I've had this adventure, how much has vanished from, before our eyes. But it's really not a time for mourning right now, because the truth is, history is inexorable, time is inexorable, but the truth is the story didn't end with those people. It just changed, that's all. And I'll tell you a little bit about the newer story today, even though I'd love to tell you some of the old stories as well. The truth of the matter is, if the older generation is gone, the action is as lively as ever before. It's just much more about young people now. And that became very clear exactly 1 year ago today, almost today, a year and 2 weeks ago, when every year before our big winter board meeting in New York City, our former board chair always sponsors a beautiful dinner for kind of our major donors. It's not a fancy, it's 60 people show up. And our former board chair pays for this. And we usually meet at one of the great restaurants in New York. And a year ago, we all met at the Mandarin Oriental, where the restaurant's on one of the really high floors, and you look out through these gigantic windows, and the whole of New York City is at your feet. It's very impressive. And there's a lot of shaking hands beforehand. And the former board chair pulled me aside, and he pulled my wife aside, and he pulled our 2 daughters, who are now in their late 20s, aside. And he said to us, "I have to warn you, there's a pandemic coming." I had never heard of this. I didn't know anything about it on February 2nd. He said it's worse than anything we have ever seen in our lifetimes, anyone alive today has seen. It's going to be devastating. And he told our kids, "You girls have to go out and start stocking up on canned goods and take money out of the bank, because none of us knows, cash out of the bank. No one knows exactly what's going to happen, but you need to be prepared." And he walked away to talk to someone else. And our girls looked at us and said, "Is he for real?" I have no idea. I don't know. I hadn't heard of it before. I didn't know. And we didn't have much time to think about it that night. We were there, in fact, to celebrate the center's 40th anniversary. That was the event. And I got up to sum up how far we had come in 40 years. And it was really quite triumphant. We were really in a great mood that night. We were all feeling very proud of what we had done. We had, saved 1.5 million books. We had digitized most of Yiddish literature. The books that we had digitized have been put online, where they've been downloaded at that point about 3 million times. We had perfected OCR, a brilliant computer scientist in the French Pyrenees, born in South Africa, grew up in Israel, trained in the United States, who was the chief programmer for the French Space Agency, and in his spare time had invented OCR technology that allows you to go into a text and type in any word on the computer, and it instantly searches 5 million bitmap pages of Yiddish literature and finds every place where that word appears. This was a revolution in Yiddish scholarship, Jewish scholarship, and that had happened just a few weeks earlier, so we all celebrated that. We had been working for 8 years on a new Yiddish textbook, and it was about to come out. Actually, it still took another 6 months, but nonetheless, it was about to come out, and everybody was thrilled about that. We had an oral history project, and we had just recorded our 1,000th interview. These are like 2-hour interviews that take 12 hours of work around them on either end. That had just happened. We had a translation program where we've been training new translators, and we had just then finished translating 70 translators who were now working on full-length works of Yiddish literature, and we had finished a 40th anniversary fundraising campaign in which we had raised $50 million, largely in endowment funding in honor of our 40th anniversary. Thank you for that applause. I feel exactly the same way. And that was really Min HaShamayim as well. We couldn't believe it. We never thought we would be able to do that. It was enormously gratifying. And I remember leaving the hotel that night, This was in February. It was cold outside, and I went with my family. We all walked out onto the street, and we all felt so buoyant and so optimistic. The future looked so bright to us that night. And the only cloud as we headed home that night was the kind of echo of the board chair's words of warning. I didn't really know what it meant. It's kind of in the back of my mind. It still echoed. Well, obviously, all of us learned what that meant pretty quickly from there. It was shortly after that, as you know, that the reports of COVID cases in China and Europe started mounting. The president assured us that there would be, quote, no more than 5 cases in the United States, but it only took a few days for that to be disproven. The warning started to grow. Despite inaction in Washington, we decided to act. So not knowing what was coming, we put systems in place so that every one of our staff members could remain connected by computer and internet if, in fact, people had to start working from home. We did all that very quietly. We put telephone forwarding in place. And I have to say it did come to that. On March 13th, that was a Friday, I woke up that morning at about 5 o'clock in the morning, and I said, we have no choice. We're going to have to close. This is when everything was just starting to close down, which is easier said than done. You have to coordinate with the police department and with the campus security. We're on a college campus, and with the fire department and with heating, monitoring, and there were a million different things that had to be taken care of. It took us all day to do it. Our staff members were crestfallen as they left that day, and I was the last to leave. It was a Friday. It was already starting to get dark. It was Erev Shabbos. And I left, and I put on the alarm, and I locked the door. And I have to tell you, like, I had tears in my eyes. And it had been a very, very busy day. There hadn't been time to think of anything. But by that point, when I locked that door, I had tears in my eyes and a lump in my throat. And I thought, oh, my God, 40 years we've been doing this, and this is how it's going to end. This is it. We locked the door and had no idea when we would get back. Well, that was a very sad Shabbos that night. Our daughters had come home, at that time 28 and 26. Our younger daughter Chava had come off the train the day before from New York, and she was carrying with her this little suitcase, like about yay big, like you would bring for a weekend trip. And I said, Chava, what's with that little tiny suitcase? She says, well, this is only temporary. I'm going back in 4 days. Yes, 8 months later, she finally, went back. And we all have our own stories to tell about the pandemic, I'm sure. I can only tell you that our older daughter, Sasha, had recently graduated from the Fletcher School at Tufts in international law and diplomacy, with a specialization as a logistician working on logistics, trying to do relief work, in the field. That's what she had been trained in. So she took over our whole house. We didn't quite know what we were doing, but she set up a disinfection station in the garage. And every time we came home from the grocery store, she would take the carrots and spray them with disinfectant and quarantine them for 2 days in the garage. And you can just imagine the level of all the uncertainty and the dismay. It was a sad Saturday as well, but by Monday morning, the shock had kind of given way to a new sense of, given way to determination. And that wasn't true just for me. It was true of our entire staff. There were 40 people working there at the time. By 9 a.m., we'd called a meeting. Every one of our staff members was online, on Zoom, many of them for the very first time ever. That morning, we heard a prediction on NPR that said they were projecting that between 1/4 and 1/3 of all of the country's nonprofit organizations would be bankrupt before the pandemic was over. And I was determined that that wasn't going to happen to us. Fortunately, we were in pretty good shape. We had always run a very tight ship. Our donors had been generous. We had no debt. We had a balanced budget. We had a reasonable endowment, but we understood we were going to have to be exceedingly careful to get through all of it. We got a little bit of PPP money at the beginning from the government money as well. But the main head start that we had was that we had already digitized our books. So as far as most of the world was concerned, even though our doors were closed to the public, everything went on as before. Anyone who we were the only place in the world that had made Yiddish literature available online. Most of our titles were available, and that was completely seamless. We never lost 1 second. We went on uninterrupted. We had one staff member running that from home. And in fact, what we saw happen was almost overnight, there was a spike in demand for those books. And I'm not exactly sure why. It might be that people suddenly had more time on their hands and they wanted to read books they couldn't read before. for whatever reason, the demand increased dramatically, and we've had about 1 million additional downloads since the pandemic began. These numbers, I have to just tell you, are astonishing, since most leaders in the Jewish world who never gave us any money for the organization always insisted, don't you know that Yiddish is dead? Don't you know this is all over? Don't you know no one reads the language anymore? In fact, by the way, I'll just throw this out there for you if you're interested. In fact, the number of Yiddish speakers in the world is growing almost exponentially right now. Anyone know why that is? I was making a sign of pay us there, because the reason is the Hasidic world, not Lubavitcher, who are now giving up on Yiddish, but the rest of the Hasidic world are still Yiddish speaking. And they have on the average 9 children per family. And as a result, that grows really, really, really quickly. So the number of Yiddish speakers in the world is actually growing at a very rapid rate right now, which is extraordinary in its own rate. Right. So the number of downloads, continued. In the meantime, the younger members of our staff showed extraordinary ingenuity in helping us to put the book, to make other programs available online. We had already scheduled a program for the following weekend that was supposed to take place at our building in Amherst. It was a really tiny program. It was a study of 7 different translations of a single 6-line Yiddish poem by a writer named Aaron Lansky. We would have been lucky to get a minion for that event if we had held it in person in Amherst. Instead, we put the program online. We announced it through our website, and over 900 people showed up for that program. There's an expression in Yiddish, they say, "Azoi koch men lokshen." That's how you make the noodles. Suddenly we realize, wow, if a really obscure program about something not many people we thought cared about could attract that many people, imagine what else we could do. So we quickly started a new series of Thursday night programs. It took a little while to figure out the technology, get the whole thing running. I had to quickly spend another $100 a month for more broadband so that we could actually do it from home and present these. But once all that was put into place, we started doing this. The great secret was you could get really impressive lecturers who would be willing to speak for free or almost free because of the pandemic. And we started putting on these programs, and they were attracting, and we've done it every week since, they attract anywhere from maybe 700 to 2,000 or 3,000 people every Thursday night. And anyone want to guess what the most popular of all was? I can't hear you, so you can't really do this. But the most popular of all the programs was a program on Jews and Mahjong, which brought in over 300,000 viewers. And apparently Mahjong is very Jewish, in case you didn't know that. And then 2 weeks ago, we did a program with myself and Hankus Netsky. Hankus is the founder of the Klezmer Conservatory Band, and it was he who, in the winter of 1980, founded the Klezmer Conservatory Band and single-handedly set in motion the revival of modern klezmer music. Everything we know now all started with Hankus in February of 1980, and that took place exactly 90 miles away from Amherst, where the Book Center was founded by me 1 month later. So there had to be something in the air back then that allowed all that to happen at the same time. But that program brought in about 4,000 viewers and still a few thousand more on Facebook afterwards. We recast all of our other programs as well. Translation continued. It was a huge job, but we were training these people. We had received help from a number of different donors to make it possible. And then at one point I received a call from the head, this is long before the pandemic, from the head of Steven Spielberg's foundation, and she said to me, "Steven would like to see you." And I knew that Steven Spielberg, who had been very generous to us, had a reputation of never meeting with the people that he funded. I said, "Really? You sure?" She says, "Yep, he would like to see you. Do you have any plans to be in Los Angeles?" And I said, "Well, now that you mention it, I guess I could be there next week." I got to LA. I stayed on the Universal lot in one of those hotels. There was wintertime. Next day I went down through the Universal studio. It looks right from out of the movies with the great big sound stages and people in costumes and the gaffers with the duct tape hanging from their belts. And I got to Spielberg's office, and it's in the middle of all these things that look like Walmarts. There's this very lovely, perfectly tasteful, small hacienda-like building. I went upstairs. They brought me into this very beautiful room, and Steven came in exactly on time. He could not have been warmer, more friendly, or more I don't know how to say it, more present. He was just right there and thoroughly immersed in what we were talking about. And he said to me, I want to let you know why I asked to see you. He said, you have to understand that what I do for a living is tell stories. And he said, when I saw you a letter describing what you were doing, the fact that you have, miles of shelves of Yiddish books there, that you have all of these thousands upon thousands of volumes that, only 2% of which have been translated, that no one alive has read even a small percentage of the books that are there. You don't even know what most of them are. He said, all those stories just sitting there, just waiting. He said, for someone like me who tells stories for a living, he said, that was just irresistible. And he funded the program so we could train this new generation of translators. And now we have amazing books coming out. Titles like Oedipus in Brooklyn, not exactly what you're expecting Yiddish literature to be. Titles by women writers who were overlooked in their own time that were never translated. Titles from Israel. A translator in Scotland just translated that. We met a guy named Zachary Berger, who's a professor in the medical school at Hopkins, who just 2 weeks ago released a translation of prose works by the great Yiddish poet Avram Sutzkever. Another woman, Rose Waldman, was hired to translate a newly discovered novel by Chaim Grada, probably the greatest Yiddish novelist of the second half of the 20th century. She had trained with us, and I went down to talk to her about it at one point. We met in a coffee shop, and I noticed she was just drinking. All she drank was hot water out of a paper cup. I should have thought something of that. And if I had looked really closely, or if my wife had been with me, she would have told me in 1 second that this woman was wearing a shaitel. She was wearing a wig, but I didn't notice that. And anyways, it turns out she had studied with us. She had a degree from Hunter. She had a master's, an MFA in writing from Columbia, but she was in fact a Satmar Chassid, a Chassid from the Satmar sect, the Hungarian Hasidim. And she had been hired to translate this book by Chaim Grada, who had spent most of his work having been trained in yeshiva, broken from the traditional world, and would never have quite freed himself from that struggle. They said that he left the yeshiva, but the yeshiva never left him. And Rose could understand this in a way that few others would have been able to do, and those books are about to come out, and they'll be astonishing. And by the way, Rose eventually deduced the fact that when she had this missing manuscript, that there was a second manuscript that had to be a 2-volume work, and she thought there was more. She wasn't sure. She finally heard from a Lubavitcher Chassid in Israel who had started studying modern Yiddish literature, whom I met when I spoke at the National Library in Israel years before. And this Lubavitcher Chassid I then met, and he told me that he was now studying with a woman named Hannah Poland. And it turned out that Hannah had gotten her start in the field of Yiddish literature as a 16-year-old volunteer at the front desk at the Yiddish Book Center when she was living in Amherst as a kid. So it's a small world, and when we hear things like that, we now have 1,600 alumni of our programs, and they're all active, and they're all extraordinary, and that's just enormously gratifying. Rabbi, how am I doing on the time now? I've got...
So I think we'll give people a chance if you want to type in questions. I'm going to moderate later. We're not going to get to the questions just yet. We'll let you keep speaking. But I want to ask you a few questions also, before people start asking questions. So
okay, you got it. You're number one.
Yeah.
Right.
Why don't you take a few more minutes?
Okay. This is going to be definitely on one foot, but I have to tell you a few more things, and then we can move on. I want to tell you that we've thanks to a young woman named Krista Whitney who came to study with us, we have been recording oral history interviews as well. She used to fly all over the world. She'd go to Cape Town and to Melbourne and spend a month in Melbourne where everybody was still speaking Yiddish. And she was recording interviews every day. She'd recorded, I told you, well over 1,000 interviews. She didn't want to lose these. She knew there were people that she had to get to quickly. And she figured out a way to record oral history interviews remotely as well. So instead of getting on an airplane, she did it online. She's done about 200 interviews this past year. She's told me it's not perfect, but at least she doesn't lose these interviews while there's still time. We were also very worried about our flagship educational programs. We have programs for high school students, for college students, for grown-ups, for Jewish day school teachers, for rabbis. We had all these programs. They all took place in the summer, and we realized we couldn't do any many of them, because of the pandemic. Fortunately, once again, the younger people in our staff quickly, took a month, but they figured out how to recast all these programs online. It even became an upgrade in a way. For example, the high school program was a 1-week immersion program for high school students called Great Jewish Books, where they study modern Jewish literature, not just Yiddish, but from all languages in English. It's usually a 1-week program, but since it was online, we figured, what the heck, we'll make it into a 6-week program. And the students were thrilled, and everybody was very happy with this. The students rolled with all of it. The demand for all of these programs just skyrocketed. It wasn't all smooth sailing. We cut our budget by 20%. We did have to do a few layoffs. We tried very hard to keep most people on the payroll. We had pay cuts for senior staff, which I'm happy to say were just restored last week because we're doing well enough. But overall, we learned how to do more with less, and I think that's a lesson that'll serve us very well when the world returns to normal. So I, too, am eager to open up the floor to questions, and I'm happy to start with the rabbi, except I'm going to ask the first question. So give me one more minute, because I have the obvious question that has to get asked, and the obvious question is why? Why is all this happening? Why now? What is it that young people are looking for? So I was thrilled to see that so many of you went to see Yiddish Fiddler. I'm actually kind of astonished and thrilled to see that so many of you went to see Yiddish Fiddler. I stayed away from it for a while, and finally my daughter, Chava, the younger one, talked me into going with her. So we got tickets, and we went to see it. And I have to tell you, I loved it. And I don't even like Fiddler on the Roof. I mean, I like the music. It's as catchy as anyone. But Fiddler on the Roof is almost the antithesis of the story that Shalom Aleichem wrote. Shalom Aleichem Tevye was what they called a Dorfsiad, a Jew who lives out in the middle of nowhere with no other Jews around, and all these different challenges of the modern world come in to marry one of his different daughters. And Tevye is sort of semi-educated. He's very much a folksyid, an everyday Jew. But precisely for that reason, he has to figure out by himself, with his very sparse Jewish education, has to figure out how to interpret events and how to respond to these various challenges of the modern world. And that's the genius of it, because Shalom Aleichem knew exactly what he was doing. And in that sense, Tevye was a precursor of all of us, and that every day we have to figure out for ourselves all over again what it means to be Jewish in any given circumstance. So I kind of didn't like the play, because in the play, of course, he doesn't live out in the middle of nowhere. He lives in a shtetl, in a Jewish town with 10,000 people probably. And when he doesn't know what to do, he doesn't have to figure it out on his own. He looks to the Jews, or he goes to the rabbi in the town. And it kind of missed the point of the story, I thought. But I also saw, when I saw it, that I have to just tell you, the movie, by the way, is even worse. They didn't have Zero Mostel, they had Topol, an Israeli raised actor instead. And as the movie went along, you could almost see his shirt opening up. I was sure he was going to be wearing a gold chain with a chai on it. It was also anachronistic by that point. But when I actually saw the play, I thought that the Yiddish had sort of changed it. It was fakashet. It was made kosher again by the Yiddish language, even though obviously it was written in English originally. Afterward, my daughter's friends, my daughter went to Barnard, so all her Barnard friends were there that night. And they all came running over and surrounding her. They had no idea who I was, and they could have cared less. But they kept saying, Chava, that was so cool. I can't believe it. And having the Yiddish, that is so hip. It's so great. I can't believe how cool all that is. And I thought, wow, that's kind of amazing. And I thought, how come? What are they're looking at? And I think what they were looking for was a certain authenticity and a certain relevance and immediacy and marginality that, today there are so many young people studying. They live in such a different world. It's so vastly more multicultural. And my older daughter graduated from Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota, a school that specialized in international studies. They had this beautiful ceremony where all the international students, the kids from abroad, they all go first. They all march first, and each one carries the flag of their own country. So you want to guess how many different flags there were that day? 92. I got to tell you, when I was her age, I didn't know there were 92 countries in the world, and I'm not exaggerating that. I really mean that. They live in such a vastly different world where it's really okay to be different. In fact, it's hip to be different now. In 1908, the great author Shin Ansky had a wonderful, who wrote the Dybbuk, he said, "No people spend more time talking about themselves, yet know so little about themselves as the Jews." Well, I think the world has changed enough that we can finally go back and kind of find what was missing. And in that sense, I think we are living in a very special moment. And for me, all these young people who are out there looking, it sort of reminds me of the Midrash of why Jews had to spend so long in the desert after they left Mitzrayim, after they left Egypt. 40 years, so there were all those old jokes. You said they got verblunged. Moshe didn't want to stop and ask for directions. You've heard all these jokes over the years. But the Midrash says it was because they had to wait for a new generation to be born that was kind of unbent and untraumatized by the experience of slavery before they could go to the Promised Land. And as you know, Moses himself never gets there. Well, when I finished my first book, I told my wife, I said, I think I want to write a second book. And by that point, my wife had really had it because it took me years to write the book. And she says, yeah, maybe with a second wife. But she's kind of gotten over that now, and I am working on a second book. And all I can tell you is that if the first book was about its remarkable, incredible, colorful, contentious older generation, the new book is about a very different generation. Not me, but about these younger people who are gravitating towards this and kind of excavating what we've discovered, what we've rescued all these years, and opening up these books and working with kind of ingenuity and intrepidity to share those amazing treasures with the world. So 41 years since we began, and even after a year of worldwide pandemic, all I can tell you is our work has never been more exciting. So I'll end on that note and then open it up to questions. So Rabbi, you're up first.
Well, I'll ask a few as more questions are coming in. So I'll invite you, put the questions into the chat, everybody. We would love to see them, and then I'll kind of moderate with these questions. So as you were talking about the why Yiddish question, I'm thinking about a very provocative essay that I read. And I always ask this question of people who are into Yiddish culture because I'm curious what they say, because it was very provocative. The thesis of the essay was that young people in America are feeling disillusioned with the sense of ethnic connection to the Jewish people when it comes to Israel. Right? They struggle with that. They've got a kind of universalist feel to it. And as American Jews started having complicated relationships, young American Jews with Israel, what they started doing, because everybody needs to turn to their own culture, is they started looking toward Yiddish to replace Israel as part of their consciousness. I'm curious how that thesis sits with you, and if you feel like that has any bearing on kids in their 20s now who are, starting Yiddish podcasts and going to Yiddish camp and that sense of connection in that way.
It's a great question, and it's sort of a painful question in some ways also. So it's not that I haven't heard that sentiment before. We have, say, 1,500 young people have gone through our programs over the years. There have certainly been a few here and there, who turned to Yiddish as kind of an anti-Israel alternative. We used to say that Yiddish was like a Rorschach test. Everybody found what they wanted in it. Socialism, anarchism, feminism, Marxism, everybody found everything in Yiddish. And anti-Zionism was a little part of it, but it's certainly not even remotely mainstream. If it's 1/10% of the people I've met, that would be a lot already. But there's something that goes a little deeper than that. With that, I'm talking about politically. Sure, young people question this policies of the Israeli government. I think we all do that from time to time. But to think that the state doesn't have a right to exist, no, that I haven't really heard, or that Yiddish could displace Israel. But I've heard a deeper question, and that I hear quite often, actually, and that is that when Israel was founded, of course, it was founded, after Theodor Herzl, who was a German speaker and thought that German should be the spoken language of Israel. After that, almost all the founders of Israel were Yiddish-speaking Jews from Eastern Europe. And they turned to Hebrew for a reason, not because they were speaking the language. Nobody was speaking the language back then. But because they saw it as a way of breaking from the diaspora. That for them, the diaspora was an aberration. It was a time when Jews were weak, and the only way we could ever be strong was to have a country of our own. And they therefore chose Hebrew as a way of kind of breaking from Yiddish. They even changed the pronunciation of Hebrew to what today we call Sephardic pronunciation, although that's not quite accurate. But they changed the pronunciation of Hebrew so it wouldn't sound so Yiddish to the ear. Now, there are plenty of exceptions. For example, David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister and one of the founders of modern Israel, wrote his very first book in Yiddish, not in Hebrew. But he did that because it was a book about, Israel, the land of Israel, and he wanted it to reach American Jews in particular, and he knew that if he wrote it in Hebrew, nobody would be able to read it, and so he wrote it in Yiddish in order to assure a wide readership. But that notion of negation of the Galut, first of all, let me just say, I think having chosen Hebrew over Yiddish turned out to be a brilliant move and incredibly prescient, although I'm not sure the people who came up with the idea could take credit for it or did it for this reason. But the truth was, after the Holocaust, there were 11 million Yiddish speakers in the world in 1939. By 1945, half of them had been murdered by the Nazis. So this wasn't exactly a natural death. So the Yiddish-speaking Jews of Europe were utterly decimated. And at the same time, a few years later, what we always forget is that 800,000 Jews were expelled from Arab countries where in some cases they had lived for almost 2,000 years or more. And they were all expelled and ended up in the new state of Israel. So to have imposed Yiddish by that point, it was a Mizrahi, an Eastern Jewish majority. And to have imposed Yiddish would have been the worst kind of chauvinism. And people came from all sorts of different countries speaking all different languages. And Hebrew became a lingua franca for them. And so I think there was kind of a genius in that, actually. But the problem was that the idea of negation of the Galut, negation of the diaspora, making believe it hadn't happened, dismissing it as an aberration, there's a problem in all of that. And the problem is, it's just an anthropological one. You can't exactly throw away your history and expect to know who you are. And even in Israel today, I think there's more and more understanding of that, more and more desire on the part of certainly intellectual younger people to kind of figure out their own history. So I think, Rabbi, it's actually sort of the opposite is what I see. I think both in Israel and here, there's much more interest among young people, not in rejecting Israel, but of having a broad-based embrace of Jewishness, of which Yiddish is a critical part.
So there's a lot of questions. I'm going to ask one more before I move to the question.
Sure.
Which is, I was recently reading about Salo Baron, the famous Jewish historian out of Colombia. And one of the things that he said, he was actually, he was criticizing previous historians before him, is that they tended to have what he called a lachrymose view of Jewish history, which meant that they used to tell the history of the Jews based on the persecutions that happened to the Jews, rather than kind of the achievements of the Jewish people. And one of the things that I'm noticing, and this might be one of the reasons it appeals to young people so much, is that I feel like in the rebirth of Yiddish, what you're finding is a kind of resurgence, not of the lachrymose view of Yiddish literature, though of course Yiddish literature came out of deep persecution in certain areas, but this idea that Jews could, through Yiddish literature, realize this kind of joy, this authentic culture that wasn't informed by the other, by people persecuting Jews, but rather this flowering of Judaism out of itself. And I'm curious if you've seen that as well.
Yes, of course. That expression, it's actually a German expression, Geistesgeschichte und Leidensgeschichte, the history of spirituality and the history of suffering. And that was used to refer to Heinrich Gretz, who was the first great German Jewish historian in the 1870s. That was definitely the main trend in Jewish historiography for a very long time. Later, as Jews came to America, actually in Germany and then later in America, and as Jewish life came to focus more and more on religion in America, because that was sanctioned, we had freedom of religion here, and much less tolerance for differences of culture, the kind of historical, socio-historical, cultural historical side of the Jewish story sort of got left out for a very long time. In fact, the academic field was called Judaic studies, not Jewish studies back then. That meant something very different. Judaic studies means the study of religion, of Jewish religion, as opposed to Jewish studies, which means the study of Jews, of which Judaic studies is a subset. And we kind of lost those distinctions. Now, I just have to say, Salo Baron didn't quite invent the rebirth of social history. That was actually done by a historian named Simon Dubnow, D-U-B-N-O-W, who was working in Eastern Europe, writing in Hebrew, Russian, Yiddish, German, Uh, he was the first kind of great Jewish social historian. His World History came out in 1925, I think. So, but what really happened came later. And it really didn't start in the Jewish world. It started in the broader world, where there really was a great historiographical revolution starting in the 1970s, the 1980s, starting with women's studies, African American studies, all of which started focusing more and more not on the history of ideas or of religion, but on the history of people, how people actually live their lives. And once you start in that area in the Jewish world, you can't help but you need access not only to Hebrew and German, but to Yiddish sources, of course. That was the language in which most Jews were living their lives. And as a result, we've seen this kind of historiographical revolution. 40 years ago, I used to go to Association for Jewish Studies meetings, the annual conferences. There wouldn't be two papers that used Yiddish sources, even though Yiddish had been the language of 3/4 of the world's Jews. Today, that's not at all true. Today, a great many of the papers are making use of Yiddish sources, and it would be weird for a young person to go into the field of Jewish history today and not have to learn Yiddish in order to get there. So I think we've really seen an enormous transformation, and I think all for the good. It's a much broader view of Jewish life today.
Well, let me ask a few questions. I find this last question that's been asked very interesting. Cynthia Sadler, if the rebirth of Yiddish is happening and people are doing Yiddish podcasts and it's not just about translating old books, but rather Yiddish is becoming a living language among hipsters in Brooklyn and others, right? How do you decide how you say to tweet or to friend somebody on Facebook? Like the newest words, do those get decided? Hebrew has an academy in Jerusalem that makes those decisions. How does Yiddish work?
Well, Hebrew has an academy, and Yiddish had, not quite an academy, it was definitely a conclave of sorts. There were Yiddish linguists from the old country who lived in New York and would meet regularly and decide on these neologisms. I can tell you a personal story about this. I first studied Yiddish as a college student. There was a professor at the university. I was at Hampshire College. There was a professor at UMass who spoke 20 languages, but Yiddish was his first language. He taught medieval Spanish. Literature was his academic field. He taught me Yiddish. Then I went to the program at Columbia, the YIVO program at Columbia that summer, the summer program, 1977. And that was the summer, you might remember, of the great blackout in New York City, where power went out over the whole city and stayed out for a day, and there was rioting, and it was really quite chaotic. And so we had no class the next day. The day after that, we all went back to class. Our teacher was a man named Mordechai Shechter, who was probably the greatest living Yiddish linguist at the time. And he was one of the people who would decide on these new words. So at the start of every class, he used to say, "Nu, was hetzach epis nayas?" What's new? And we'd have to go around. There were only 5 or 6 of us. And we'd go around and say what was happening. So it was my bad luck to be first that day. And I said, "Nu, says gewen a groise," and I didn't know what the word was for blackout. I said, "Gewen a groise schwarzois," a blackout. And Dr. Schechter was apoplectic, and he started screaming at me. He says, "How could you say something as ignorant as that?" He says, "Don't you know the word? The first moment when the power went out, when the lights went out, you should have lit a candle, gone to the Weinreich dictionary, the standard Yiddish dictionary of the time, and looked it up, and you would have found the Yiddish word that we had coined in the last blackout, I don't know, in 64 or 65. And the word was a verfinsterung, and darkening, which is a beautiful word. It's way better than schwarzois, I have to concede. But no, they took this very, very seriously. And today, Dr. Schechter's daughter, Gittel, and a scholar named Paul Glasser teamed up to create a new Yiddish, with us with Chava Lapin, to create a new Yiddish dictionary that came out recently that included, it was like every English, Yiddish translations for all kinds of English words, including all of those neologisms to which you refer. And I have to just tell you, although the newspapers had a field day with the neologism, they just love this kind of stuff. The truth was, they're not trivial. I mean, they're more like Verfinsterung than Schwarzois, I can assure you. They take it really seriously and come up with really great and authentically Yiddish words for all kind of things. It's just that most of us don't know those words. That's all.
I'm actually curious because the word that you said for blackout sounded like it sounded like it's Hebrew based, actually, not
Like a what?
it sounds like it's Hebrew based and not German based from what I heard, right? Isn't say the word for blackout again?
Schwarz is German for black.
No,
And,
the word that he had coined.
the Hebrew word, the Yiddish, the real word,
Yeah.
Verfinsterung. No, finster is darkness, and it's a Germanic root.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I was curious, when they go, do they look for German to derive new words from, or do they look for modern Hebrew to derive new words from?
I think neither in everything. I think they try to find authentic words that have precedent in the literature, which is vast. And there are 40,000 separate Yiddish works of modern Yiddish literature. So there's a great deal to comb through there. And there were 3,000 separate Yiddish periodicals because no Jews could agree, and they all had to have their own magazine. So they work really hard at this and take it extremely seriously. And there are two. It was another new dictionary came out this year, a few years ago as well. And these have been a huge breakthrough having that. And then, of course, now that we have our online Yiddish library, we're now teaming up with the National Library of Israel and the YIVO Institute and the New York Public Library, all four of us together, are creating what we call the Universal Yiddish Library, where we'll take digitized holdings from all our collections, put them into a single online repository, and then using these tools that our computer genius in the French Pyrenees developed for us, those will be made available. You'll be able to search through every Yiddish book that was ever written. And those kind of tools allow you to do word searches and be able to figure out what words were used and where they were used and all that. So we're on the cusp of a revolution in Jewish scholarship. So all this is about to happen. It's a very exciting time. But if you want a really good program someday, invite Gittel and Paul, who did that dictionary, invite them on to talk to you about how they came up with a new Yiddish dictionary. It's a fascinating story.
Thank you. So, next question by Larry Westreich. He want to know if anybody's writing fiction in Yiddish now. And I just, as like an aside, I'm actually a fiction judge for the National Jewish Book Award, and I feel like I've been doing it for about 5 years. Every year we have a handful of books that are translated for the first time into English from Yiddish, and because
Right.
the translation is a new translation, it gets put forward. I don't think I've yet seen something that's come out in the past few years that then got translated into English and submitted. So I'm curious if that's coming down the pike, or if it's more living in the short story realm right now. So you're not going to be finding anybody writing full novels in Yiddish.
New novels, you mean?
Yeah, new novels.
Yeah, so you must know my colleague Josh Lambert, right? Who was one of your fellow judges on the prize, I think.
He must be off before I got on.
Could be, yeah. I think he's involved with the Sammy Rourke Prize now.
Fiction prizes, so I'm the general.
Right.
So you might be
Got it. Well, speaks a certain erudition, and I applaud you for that. That's great. Although it also sounds like a lot of work to read all those books, right?
Books all fall. Yeah, it's a lot of work, but it's great. But,
That's great. Well, anyway, but I should answer your question, right?
yeah.
Which is so first, the number of translations that are coming forward that you'll be seeing, because they're new imprints, of course, is growing really fast right now. Because we have, when we started out translating, we had a program at Yale University Press, and we had like 15 erudite, amazing scholars from around the world who would pick the books that should be translated, and then we had a half dozen translators in their 80s who would do the translation. Then we finally started this new fellows program, and we're training new translators. So now there are 70 people working, which is a very big difference. And I should add that nobody gives up their day job, right? They all do this, on the side. But there are going to be a lot of new books coming down. Do you know when Moby Dick came out? It was in I think 1851, I think, when Moby Dick first appeared. And it was considered unreadable at the time. Just like when Van Gogh painted his sunflowers, everybody thought it was junk and nobody wanted to buy it. So when Moby Dick came out, even though Melville was already famous, it was considered an unreadable book. It wasn't until 75 years later that an English professor, I think at Princeton, kind of came across the book and said, "Oh my God, this is the great American novel." Well, I grew up in New Bedford, so we had to read Moby Dick. And I've now read it 3 times, and it really is the great American novel. It's extraordinary. But it wasn't appreciated in its own time, and the same applies to Yiddish literature. I think right after I'm going to get to the full question in a second, but right after...
I have a follow-up along those lines I'm going to ask you.
Okay, right after the war, before the Second World War, there was very little translating of Yiddish literature because people didn't need it. The people who were interested could read Yiddish for the most part. There were exceptions to that, Maurice Samuel and others. But after the war, most of the books that got translated were books that tried to that sort of portrayed the Jewish world in a schmaltzy way. Meaning, there's a Yiddish expression that says, alle Kale sind schön, alle Teute sind frum, which means all brides are beautiful and all dead people are pious. So if all dead people were pious, that was sort of the way of seeing, there was this kind of... this view of the Jewish world that everything was wonderful and you had to portray it that way. In the meantime, what makes for great literature? Conflict, contradiction, sexuality, violence, struggle, all the great themes of world literature, those books were kind of left out for a very long time. Now they are being translated. And you're about to see, I don't know how many Moby Dicks are sitting on our shelves, but there are some out there. I'm sure of that, and you'll be seeing them. And we now have our own publishing house called White Goat Press. So stay tuned. A lot of those books will be made available. There are new books being written in Yiddish as well, though. In addition to these new translations. It's more limited than one might think. There are a few Jews who have come out of the former Soviet Union, particularly Jews who were living in more rural areas where Yiddish was spoken till a later period, and a few of them have been writing in Yiddish now, and some of those are emerging. There are some Yiddish books coming out of the Hasidic world. This is complicated because in the Hasidic world, Yiddish literature is considered puzzle, it's treif, because it's modern literature and they're not supposed to be reading it. But a friend of mine who had been the chief Judaica bibliographer at Stanford told me that he thought that half of the downloads of our books, of these 5 million downloads, he thought as many as half of those downloads were coming out of the Hasidic world where they're not supposed to be reading these books in the first place. But when you have 9 kids, and if the man's not working, very often you need to get food stamps. And the way to get food stamps, you need a computer. And so there are more computers in Hasidic households than anybody realized. And as we like to say, what the Haskalah, or the Jewish Enlightenment movement, couldn't accomplish in 200 years, the computers in Hasidic houses are starting to accomplish in 2 years. So I think we're seeing a lot of changes there, and I wouldn't be surprised. There are already kind of sneistic, modest Yiddish writing, like detective stories and neutral things like that coming out in Yiddish in the Hasidic world. But I wouldn't be surprised to see other literature coming out of that world. There's already a vast body of what they call OTD literature, off the derech, off the path, of people who leave the Hasidic world and write about it. There are a lot of these books. Some of them are quite interesting. Usually written by people who don't know English very well, by the way, grew up speaking Yiddish.
I would
But
actually argue that unorthodox, which I'm sure half of the people, if not more, have seen, is like that. I'm sure you saw it on Netflix, right?
yes, of course. Yes, but there actually the interesting thing in unorthodox is the Yiddish is bad also. And the reason the Yiddish is bad, and that the same goes for Shtisel, by the way, which is better, but the same goes for that, because they were trying to make authentic. Those actors are not Hasidim, right? Those actors are modern secular people who learned Yiddish lines, and all of them, even Haas, who played the lead in both of those series. Uh, they all had to learn the Yiddish or learn the Yiddish lines in order to say it. But the language coaches taught them to speak the way the Hasidim speak, which is largely ungrammatical Yiddish. It was authentic in that sense, that they didn't speak like they were studying at Columbia University. They spoke a kind of, authentically bad Yiddish. So it's different. However, it's only going to take one great novel. You know, when Tolstoy wrote War and Peace, that if anyone's read War and Peace, if you read certain translations of it, the first 30 or 40 pages are not in English, they're in French, because they were written in French, and then they switched to Russian as the novel goes on, which was the truth historically in Russia in the late 18th century, early 19th centuries, that the nobility spoke French, not Russian. But it was that novel that really made the Russian people, that made the Russian country, come alive. That could happen yet for Yiddish literature coming out of the Hasidic world. It only takes one great novel to change everything. So I would say, we say in Yiddish, ot ot, just wait. We don't exactly know what's coming next. All I can say is I once had a professor who said, nobody could have invented Jewish history. It's way too improbable for that. And I think that is still true.
Yeah, yeah. And apropos of what you were saying, we'll leave the Moby Dick thing aside. One of my favorite essays on Jewish literature writ large, I think it was by Cynthia Ozick. She likens great literature and starts talking about Tolstoy, and she likens it to a shofar. I'm sure you've read
I
this.
don't know that. No, I know Cynthia, but I don't know that. So
And what she essentially says is that just as a shofar has a very tiny opening, but a very wide outside, that the great literature starts particularistic. It's writing for its world, and it's not trying to be the great world novel or the great American novel. It is about a quest for a whale, or it's about a war against France in 1812, if we're talking about War
Right.
and Peace. And what happens is that because of its particularity, it somehow hits on something that becomes universal for everybody. And I think
Exactly. Yeah.
Yiddish literature feels to me like it's not trying to be universal. Like no Yiddish author that I've ever read is thinking about writing outside of for its own sake or for its own community. And what happens there is because of that, it's not watered down. It's particularistic enough that it hits that when it does hit on universal themes, it does it in such a way that it's a new take on it, which I think like makes it like a shofar into
I
wide.
yeah. I agree with that completely, except for a few writers, most notably Isaac Bashevis Singer, who
Yes.
certainly wrote for the well, many in the Yiddish world thought he wrote it for the cheap seats, that he was too popular. Someone like Chaim Grada, whom most of you have probably never heard of, is one of the most brilliant, Jewish writers that ever lived. But he's very particularistic and never he writes about very deeply specific Jewish issues, whereas Bashevis wrote about broad existential issues set against an exotic Jewish backdrop. That was a very different enterprise. But in the end, it was Bashevis Singer whose books were in the airport bookstores and not Chaim Grada's, and I think that was the reason for it. By the way, we recently were given the recently discovered manuscript of Isaac Bashevis Singer's first ever work that he wrote when he was 19 years old. It turned up in an attic in Bilgoraj, a shtetl, former shtetl in Poland, and we went to Poland and we met with the woman who had found it, and it was an amazing adventure. And you'll invite me back another time. I'll tell you that story because it was really quite a saga.
Awesome. So thank you. We're reaching our end. So I'll ask just, I guess, one more question. I'll try to collapse two questions into one, which is the outskirts of Yiddish, the outskirts of world Jewish literature that are not directly Yiddish fiction. Things like Ladino or Jewish Arabic, Judeo-Arabic, things like Yizkor books. I'm curious, like, what is, in terms of your collection, what stops at your collection? Like, what are the borders of when you are in mission in book collecting and not in mission in book collecting?
Sure. We collect all sorts of Jewish books. We don't limit ourselves to Yiddish. It's just that most of what was out there was in Yiddish because that's what most Jews were reading up until a certain point. And I don't want to be inundated with all kind of old Sidorim and that kind of thing. That we don't handle. That we pass those on. Those books are generally buried when they're no longer usable. Religious books of that sort. But we get a tiny bit of modern Hebrew literature, a little bit, and Ladino books generally not. Although there's a young scholar out in Seattle named Devin Nar who wants to do for Ladino what we've done for Yiddish and collect modern Ladino literature. And I've been working with him. I went out there to see him, and it's nowhere near the scale of what we confronted with Yiddish, but we certainly would support any effort like that and applaud it. I think it's a wonderful thing. Intellectually, though, is a different story. Book collection's one thing. Intellectually, we embrace all of Yiddish, all of Jewish literature. I think it's intellectually dishonest, really, to isolate Yiddish literature. The truth is that almost every major writer of Yiddish literature in the early years, meaning in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, writers like Shalom Aleichem, like Yud Lamed Peretz, like Mendel Moicha Sforim, every one of those writers also wrote in Hebrew, and in some cases in other languages as well. Someone like Mendele, whose real name was Shalom Abramovich, is considered the father of modern Hebrew literature, and he's considered the Zayder or the grandfather of modern Yiddish literature. So suddenly to kind of like bifurcate this and have a war between Hebrew and Yiddish, it's preposterous. It was all the same thing. It's just some people chose to write in the vernacular and some people chose to write in a more lofty language. Just like the major writers of Hebrew literature up to a certain point. Shai Agnon, who was a cousin of my grandmother's, Shai Agnon, he wrote some of the greatest Hebrew literature ever written, but he was a Yiddish speaker initially, of course. He came from a small town. His name was Chachkish, not Agnon. And he came from a small shtetl called Buchach in Galicia. So, it goes both ways. I'd say the two languages are inextricably tied. Hebrew and Yiddish are inextricably tied to one another. And I would say all Jewish literatures share a common sensibility. When you read Isaac Babel, who wrote in Russian, when you read Philip Roth, who wrote in English, when you read Grace Paley, who wrote in English but with a Yiddish syntax, if you didn't know what language, if you weren't told what language they had written in originally, I'm not sure you would be able to distinguish one from the other. And there's greatness in all of them. So when we teach, particularly when we teach high school students, the program's called Great Jewish Books, not Great Yiddish Books, and we embrace all of modern literature in English translation, and the students love it. It's a revelation. And I should add that none of that literature is taught in Jewish day schools. We weren't able to make that happen. So not being able to kind of change the curricula, we ended up kind of going direct to the students, have more students than we can possibly accept for all of these programs now. And we then started a program to leverage it by teaching high school teachers in Jewish day schools. They come to Amherst, they study with us for 4 or 5 weeks. They then go back and figure out how to integrate this literature they just discovered, into their own curricula back home. So all of this is kind of the slightly subversive way of changing and kind of righting the balance and making Jewishness whole once again. Before I have to end, though, I'll just say I want to extend an invitation to everybody. It's lovely seeing you all in your little boxes here, but we're all a little bit tired, I think, and weary of Zoom at this point. The Yiddish word for it, ausgezumt, you've had enough of the Zooming. I think we all suffer a little bit from that, and I would like nothing more than to see all of you. A young person said to me recently, he said, I just so miss seeing people in 3 dimensions. So when we finally can see each other 3-dimensionally again, I want to invite you to come up to Amherst. We have this magnificent, actually 2 buildings that look like one. Alice, who's a very long-standing, Alice Goldfarb, a long-standing friend of the center, has been there many, many times for our programs, and I'm sure others have been there as well. The building's beautiful. The buildings are beautiful. It sort of looks like a shtetl, but inside it's nothing like a shtetl, meaning it's open and bright and forward-looking and really creative, and it makes you feel really good when you're there. And it's one thing we're doing during the pandemic, since the building's closed anyways, is we're investing $500,000 into developing a very major new core exhibition in the building, which will be ready a year from this coming spring. So, but don't wait for that. As soon as things open up again, as soon as it's safe, as soon as we're all vaccinated, we will reopen our doors as well, and we will welcome everybody with open arms, and we will hug everybody because we're desperate for that as well. So really, I would love to see all of you come. And in the meantime, if you can't do that, while we're waiting, I would invite all of you to join us as members. It's $36 a year, inflation, $54 a year to sign up as a member. And you'll get our magazine, you'll get all of our online features, you'll get a weekly reader that comes. We're working really hard to deliver the content of this culture in all sorts of fun and accessible ways. So join us. It takes everybody to make this happen. And to all of you who have been members all these years, I want to say thank you to all of you as well. And Rabbi, thank you so much for making this possible. I'm very grateful to you.
I mean, I enjoyed the conversation. I know I'm already seeing people put into the chat how much they enjoyed it. Once again, I'm going to paste into the chat for everybody a link if you want to buy the book from our local bookstore. We would love for you to buy that. Otherwise, you can find it online. And I want to say thank you to Norm Pollock and to Alice Goldfarb, who made tonight happen and who came up with the idea and talked to us. I want to say that if you want to study some Yiddish literature, Norm runs actually a weekly on Thursday afternoons, a weekly short story class. And I would say about a quarter of Norm's short stories to maybe a third of Norm's short stories are Yiddish short stories in translation, in addition to things like Philip Roth and things like that. And so if you want to join, feel free, anybody here, and you can find that on our website or on our e-blast. So with that, I want to say thank you once again. I'll allow people to unmute themselves so you can say thank you. And
thank you. Thanks.
Thanks very much.
Have a good night.
Thank you. Aaron, this is Fran Feynman in Los Angeles, the David Victor Foundation.
Yes.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great. I could tell because of the Golden Gate Bridge behind you.
Well, I changed it just for you.
Well, I was